A very good afternoon, Singapore's Emeritus Senior Minister, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, Your Excellencies, respected co-editors and panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the launch of the book, ASEAN and India, The Way Forward. We are honored to have with us Emeritus Senior Minister Goh Chok Tong, gracing this special occasion and launching this timely publication. Thank you, sir. The book is coordinated and co-edited by Ambassador at Large, Professor Tommy Koh, Mr. Harnik Singh, Deputy Director at ISAS, and Ms. Mo Tuza, Fellow ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute. Today's book launch is put together by the Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore and World Scientific Publishing. Ladies and gentlemen, we are also pleased to share with you that the National Library has come on board to be a venue sponsor for this event. Thank you, Mr. Ng. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure now to invite Mr. Ng Che Pong, Chief Executive Officer, National Library Board, to deliver the welcome remarks. Mr. Ng, please.
Our guest of honor, Emeritus Senior Minister Goh Chok Tong, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. Welcome to the National Library building and to the official launch of the book ASEAN and India, The Way Forward. The book is a riveting account of the relationship between ASEAN and India, as seen through the eyes of diplomats, business leaders, and academics. This relationship is a long and important one that goes well beyond the 30 years since dialogue relations were established between the two parties in 1992. The spread of Hinduism and Buddhism, for example, from India to Southeast Asia, left enduring traces in remarkable monuments that we enjoy as tourists today, such as Angkor Wat in Cambodia and Borobudur and Prambanan in Indonesia. That versions of the Indian epic Ramayana are performed in almost every ASEAN member state is further testimony to the extent of India's cultural influence. Southeast Asia, in turn, played an important role in the retransmission of these influences. In the 7th century, for example, the famed Tang Dynasty monk Yi Jing spent several years in Palembang, which was then a center for Buddhist studies. Yi Jing was on his way back from India, I think where he spent several years in Nalanda, back to China, and he decided to make a stopover in Palembang. And it was a lengthy stopover, as it turned out, because he spent many years there where he translated Buddhist scriptures from Sanskrit into Chinese. Yi Jing was so impressed with Palembang, particularly the high level of Buddhist scholarship there, that he advised Chinese monks to spend a year or two studying there before going to India onward on their pilgrimage. So this is just one of the many fascinating historical accounts of the interactions between Southeast Asia and India. I believe many readers of this book will be inspired by the 34 chapters to see new ways in which we can deepen our bilateral ties. You'll certainly inspire my colleagues and I. As part of the Singapore storytellers role that we have in the National Library Board, we are always keen to find new ways to share about how Singapore's heritage and identity have been shaped over the years. This book, with its perspectives on ASEAN-India ties, will further inform us on how we grew as a nation and enrich the stories we tell. So I wish to thank the authors of each of the chapters and the co-editors of this book, Professor Tommy Koh, Mr. Harnik Singh, Deputy Director of the Institute of South Asian Studies, and Ms. Mo Tuza, ICS Fellow at the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute, for inspiring us with this insightful book. I'm also looking forward very much to the speeches and panel discussion later. So once again, congratulations on the launch of this book, and have a good evening ahead, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ng. Ladies and gentlemen, I shall now invite Ms. Sandhya Venkatesh, Assistant Director, Social Sciences, World Scientific Publishing, to give her remarks on behalf of the publishers. Sandhya, please.
Emeritus Senior Minister Goh Chok Tong, Ambassador Tomiko, Ambassador Ong Kim Gyong, dignitaries, colleagues, and dear friends. Good evening and a warm welcome to all of you to the launch of ASEAN and India, The Way Forward. This book is timely as 2022 marks the 30th anniversary of the dialogue relations between ASEAN and India. This year has also been designated the ASEAN-India Friendship Year. World Scientific is honored to be the publisher of this important book. And one of World Scientific's core missions is to publish important books on Singapore and the region and make it available to as many readers as possible from all over the world. This book begins with the history of relations between ASEAN and India and proceeds to discuss trade relations, investment relations, cultural ties, people-to-people ties, business ties, and then proceeds to examine various perspectives on regional comprehensive economic partnership, attitude towards China, and the Asia-Pacific versus the Indo-Pacific. The next section looks at the future with particular focus on smart cities, digital economy and e-commerce, environment and sustainability, and human security. The last section of the book examines the dynamics, past and future of ASEAN-India relations. The topics and themes covered in the book are timely, relevant, and I believe these will pave way for future research. I'm sure you'll find the book interesting and engaging, and I did find it so. This is because as someone who was born and raised in India and now living in Singapore, I was able to connect with the book at a personal level. Southeast Asia has been mentioned in ancient texts of India. References to maritime, cultural, and business relations between India and Southeast Asian nations are sporadically mentioned in texts of Ramayana and Mahabharata, but probably with different names. I had pondered in the past as to why, despite the cultural, business, and people-to-people ties between India and the ASEAN region, the relations between the two regions remains largely unexplored. And the cooperation between the two regions, which is currently far below the potential, will elevate and enrich the relationship between the two regions. This book, according to me, as a reader and as a publisher, fills the gap and appeals to anyone pondering over the same question. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I wish you a pleasant evening ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandhya. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure next to invite a very charming and one of the most loved persons by Singaporeans, Indians, and ASEAN nationals alike. It's none other than Ambassador at Large, Professor Tomiko, to introduce the book ASEAN and India, The Way Forward. Professor Ko, please.
Thank you very much, Sitara. ESM Goh Chok Tong, Your Excellencies, friends who have written chapters of the book, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of my two co-editors, Hanek and Mo, and on my own behalf, I would like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. We would like to thank ESM Go for accepting our invitation to be our guest of honor and to launch the book for us. For those of you who do not know ESM very well, he has a very good sense of humor. I wrote to invite him to be our GOH, and in his reply he said that he was happily retired and asked me why I was disturbing him in his retirement. So I then replied and said that he's the ideal person to launch a book because he's India champion both in Singapore and in ASEAN. All of us in Singapore will remember that it was he who started a mild Indian fever in Singapore. And we have never recovered from it since. The government of India has publicly thanked you, Mr. Goh, for championing their cause in ASEAN. The next person I want to thank is my friend, Mr. Ng Chepong, the CEO of the National Heritage Board. Chepong, thank you for hosting the event and for your very thoughtful remarks about the historical and cultural links between India and Southeast Asia. I would also like to thank our publisher, World Scientific Publishing, for its confidence in us. We would like to single out two friends in WSB for special mention, and these are Jiang Yulin, our editor, who is somewhere here in the back, Yulin, and our designer of the book, Ng Chun Chun, who's not here. Thank you, Sandhya, for your remarks, and I hope that the book will be commercially successful, so you make some money from the book. I would like next to thank the 42 friends from ASEAN and India who contributed chapters to the book. 4 of them are here, and I'd like to mention their names. We have Sharon Sia, who wrote a very good paper on cooperation between the two in climate change and green economy. We have Manu Bhaskaran, who did a very good piece on trade. Karan Singh Takrao, who did a very good essay on business links between India and ASEAN. And I would especially like to thank a friend from Indonesia who came all the way from Jakarta to join us, Pat Aditya Nugraha, who is an expert on air and space law. On every topic in the book, Nalina Gopal is also here, I'm sorry. On every topic in the book, the 3 editors were able to find a pair of writers, one from ASEAN and one from India. The contrasting perspectives, for example, on RCEP, Sulaima Mahmud from ASEAN and Sudhir Devare from India, are very rich and informative. So also, for example, the pair essays on China, Shiv Shankar Menon from India and Mo on behalf of ASEAN. I think these pairs of essays on each topic helps each side to understand the other side better. I would also like to thank the 3 illustrious persons who contributed the 3 forwards to the book. The Foreign Minister of Singapore, Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, the Minister of External Affairs of India, Dr. Jai Shankar, and the ASEAN Secretary General, Lim Jock Hoi. Finally, I'd like to thank, no, not finally. I would like to thank Ong Keng Yong, who's here, and the High Commissioner of India, P. Kumaran, for writing the 2 concluding essays. High Commissioner is not here, but Keng Yong very kindly agreed to join us today and to take part in the panel discussion later. Finally, I would like to thank Professor Tan Tai Yong, Chairman of ISAS, Professor Iqbal Singh Sevier, the Director, our MC Setara Doresami, Mr. Jordan Ang, and Winnie Fred Gurong for helping us with the book and in organizing the book launch. I will stop here in order not to preempt what ESM Go is going to say to us. I will save my comments on the book for the panel discussion later. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Koh. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great honor now to invite a guest of honor who's globally admired and respected leader, none other than Singapore's Emeritus Senior Minister Goh Chok Tong to deliver his address. ESM, please.
Excellencies, Tommy, friends, and ladies and gentlemen. As Tommy said, I am happily retired. I am happy to be able to go around Singapore doing the little things which you do, which I could not do when I was Prime Minister. However, I always ask my wife, how is that, despite wearing my mask, people could recognize me. So there are still certain things I cannot do because I can be recognized anywhere. I'm certainly happy to be here to launch the book on the way forward for ASEAN and India. But the way forward cannot just be about forging closer ties between ASEAN and India. Our future must surely be affected by developments in the rest of Asia and the geopolitical relationship between China and the US. Will the 21st century be the Asian century or herald Asia's misery? This question has been on my mind for a long time. Even before COVID-19, the world was becoming more dangerous and divided, and Asia is being divided. A war in Asia is not going to break out tomorrow, but it is not unimaginable in the decades ahead. This is precisely why the relationship between ASEAN and India is so important. We must work together to create the Asia we want. We cannot just be price-taking bystanders. India and ASEAN are home to more than 2 billion people, 1/4 of the world, and have a combined GDP of almost $6 trillion. Both of us are diverse polities with rich histories. We share long and deep ties. We have a common goal of advancing peace and prosperity in the region. We hold shared values in strengthening multilateralism and working within an open, inclusive regional framework. I've always believed that the 21st century cannot be the Asian century without a successful India. When I was Prime Minister, I recognized that forging a strategic alliance with India would be in Singapore's and ASEAN's interests. Singapore strongly advocated for India's admission to the ASEAN family in 1992 as a sectoral dialogue partner. Not long after, in 1994, India became a full dialogue partner. It was also admitted as a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum in 1996 and participated at the East Asia Summit from its inception in 2005. Today, India is one of ASEAN's most important partners. Our relations continue to grow from strength to strength. In his keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke at length about ASEAN centrality. He said that India's vision for the Indo-Pacific region was a positive one, and ASEAN had been and would be central to its future. This is not mere rhetoric. It is reality. India is ASEAN's 6th largest trading partner and ASEAN's 7th largest source of foreign direct investment. ASEAN and India are also about to commence the review of the ASEAN-India Trade in Goods and Agreement, which will strengthen our regional economic integration. ASEAN and India are also connected in other ways beyond trade. The India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway is on track for completion and may be extended to other ASEAN member states. The ASEAN-India network of universities was just launched in August. to promote people-to-people as well as academic exchanges. Singapore continues to advocate and champion for India within ASEAN. As the current country coordinator for ASEAN-India relations, we have worked with India and our fellow ASEAN member states to mark our 30th anniversary of relations in several substantive ways. First, India successfully hosted a special ASEAN-India Foreign Ministers meeting in New Delhi in June 2022. Second, both sides have agreed to convene an ASEAN-India Defense Ministers informal meeting at an ASEAN-India maritime exercise. Third, and most importantly, ASEAN and India are working towards establishing a comprehensive strategic partnership. This will enhance collaboration in several strategic areas, including the digital economy, green transitions, and space. The partnership will be a springboard for greater cooperation between ASEAN and India. As we enter a period of greater geostrategic flux, it is important, now more than ever, to reinforce the interdependence and strong ties between ASEAN and India. India's inclusion in the ASEAN framework strengthens our regional security architecture and adds a stabilizing force in the region. This book is on ASEAN and India, the way forward. I'm pleased to launch it as part of the Friendship Year of ASEAN-India relations in 2022. I congratulate the book's editors, Professor Tommy Koh, Harnett Singh, Mo Tuza, for bringing together a diverse group of scholars and practitioners to share the expert perspectives. I hope politicians and policymakers will be inspired by the book to take our relations to new heights. Let me end with a quote from former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, whom I have met several times and consider a wise man. Quote, "India's destiny is interlinked with that of Asia, and more so with Southeast Asia," unquote. I hope India and ASEAN will continue to strengthen their vital relationship and together build the future we want, an Asia century of peace and prosperity. Congratulations, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you, ESM. May we invite the co-editors on stage as well to join ESM Go to launch the book. ESM Go and Professor Koh will lift the cloth and unveil the cover to signify the official launch of ASEAN in India, the way forward. Yes, Prof. 2, 3. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the book is now officially launched. On behalf of the three co-editors, Professor Koh will present a signed copy of the book to ESM. That is a signed copy by the three co-editors. Thank you, ESM. And next, we are going to have the pleasure of inviting our book contributors to take a photograph with ESM. May I invite Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, Mr. Manu Bhaskaran, Ms. Sharon Sia, Mr. Karan Singh Thakral, Mr. Rita Aditya Nagura, and Ms. Nalina Gopal. May we have you on stage as well, please. While these book contributors are taking a photograph with the guest of honor, we like to acknowledge that most of the book contributors are based either in India or in the other parts of the ASEAN countries. Thus, they're not able to join us in person for today's event.
Yes and no.
Thank you, ESM, co-editors, and chapter contributors. Sure, ESM. Ladies and gentlemen, ESM Go will take its leave now while we set the stage for the panel discussion. He's got another engagement to attend to. On behalf of the co-editors and organizers, we would like to once again extend our heartfelt appreciation to ESM Go for gracing this occasion and launching the book. Please take your seat while we set the stage for the next segment, the panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the next segment of today's event, the panel discussion on the book ASEAN and India, The Way Forward. I would like to invite the following panelists to take their seats on stage for the book discussion. Co-editors, Professor Tommy Koh, Mr. Harunik Singh, and Ms. Mo Tukar. I would also like to invite Ambassador at Large, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, former Secretary General of ASEAN, to join on the panel. And ladies and gentlemen, you will like to note that ASEAN is always on Ambassador Ong's mind. And interestingly, his WhatsApp profile also carries the message, ASEAN at work. And chairing the session is the Director of the Institute of South Asian Studies, Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sevia. I shall now hand over the session to Dr. Iqbal, please.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the book launch and the panel discussion on the book that we are dealing with today, ASEAN and India, The Way Forward. As many of you are familiar, those of you who've had a chance to actually flip through the book thus far, this book is a comprehensive, holistic review of relations between ASEAN and India, but it also looks forward, and in this sense, it's brought writers who are from academia, the policy world, the business world, civil society, etc., and it provides a holistic approach towards how we should understand relations between India and ASEAN, but also how this can be taken forward. So in this sense, and I paraphrase the various authors and the editors of the volume, when they say that they seek to provide an overview of ASEAN-India relations, but also to act as an inspiration to policymakers on both sides, and for both sides to explore ways to further elevate their bilateral relationship. Earlier we had Emeritus Senior Minister Goh Chok Tong speak about the broad contours that have shaped India-ASEAN relations, but also the broad contours that will continue to shape geopolitics in Asia, specifically with regards to this book, relations between ASEAN and India. To take that conversation forward, we have with us an esteemed panel, and I don't want to take any more time, and I want to open the floor up to our panelists. You're very familiar with them, but very briefly, the three editors of the volume, Professor Tommy Koh, Mr. Harnik Singh, Ms. Mo Tozar, and we also have on stage with us a contributor. In fact, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong wrote one of the concluding chapters of the book. And I should add here that another concluding chapter was written by the Indian High Commissioner, P. Kumaran, who unfortunately cannot join us today. And now, without further ado, we are going to reverse the order that we had set out with, and I'm going to invite Mo Tozar to please share some of her reflections about this volume and on this theme itself. So Mo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Prof. Iqbal. A very good afternoon to everyone who's taken time out of their schedules to be with us here today at the launch of this co-edited venture, of which I think I've benefited the most from this exercise of co-editing, together with people such as Professor Tommy Koh and Her Naik. I consider Professor Tommy as a mentor, and he's always an inspiration. So it's also been a great learning journey, I think, for me to actually be a co-editor together with Prof. Tommy on this book. So when we first started plotting it, if I could use that word, of what to do as our contribution for 30 years of ASEAN-India dialogue relations, and really, I think the intention was to give back something substantive in terms of recommendations and also inputs to charting the way forward. So I guess when three more or less academics put their heads together, this is what you get in terms of the contribution. And with every cycle of the anniversaries of dialogue relations between ASEAN and a particular dialogue partner rolling around, we always try to think of what was done in the past and then what can be built upon to bring it that much more forward into the future. And so this exercise also was really, as the op-ed piece in today's Straits Times edition mentions, it was also an exercise of looking back to look forwards, to really look at what's been done in the past, what's worked, what's not worked so well, what more can be done. And of course, we're at a very interesting juncture in history, in contemporary history. We've just started emerging out of several years of lockdown, of keeping ourselves isolated in response to a global pandemic. And we're still only trying, I think only now starting to come to terms with what the implications of that pandemic has been on our collective psyche and how we do things together collaboratively. But we've also, I think, through the pandemic, learned about new ways of how we can get things going, keep things going, despite having to distance ourselves physically. And I think the essays in this book also reflect that to a certain extent. I think we encourage the essays to be forward-looking, to really look at what's not been explored or examined so much in detail, and how to, I think, move forward with more creative or innovative ways. So for me, I think most of my ASEAN learning and training under Mr. Ong Keng Yong's mentorship at the ASEAN Secretariat has been in the socio-cultural areas. So I was particularly interested to see, to invite, and to learn from the contributions from authors who are experts in this field. And the socio-cultural sphere actually is so multifaceted and multidimensional. There are so many practical, functional, as well as more aspirational areas. So I think that's where the value of the contributions in this book is for me, and I'm speaking more from that socio-cultural, people-to-people type of linkages. The priorities are there. Ever since the sectoral dialogue, as we call it, between ASEAN and India started way back in 1993, the priorities that were identified as the main thematic areas, topics to deal with, of course, the main priority, I think, for ASEAN-India dialogue has been focused at trade and investment, and we've heard many reflections on that this afternoon. But for the recognition, of course, of these interactions was also premised on having that people dimension, and therefore tourism has been there as one of those priority areas for cooperation since the beginning, since 1993. And the other area was science and technology. That was the other priority. And I think when these priorities also served as that continuity link, when ASEAN and India elevated that sectoral partnership to full dialogue partnership in 1996 onwards, those were also the continuing priorities: trade and investment, tourism, infrastructure was added, human resource development was added, and again, people-to-people interaction. But how those priorities, I think, have been acted upon, particularly I'm speaking about the people-to-people dimension, the potential is there. And I think as we've highlighted in our op-ed today, that potential hasn't been fully realized. And so looking at it from that socio-cultural perspective and view, from the people dimension, there's a lot more, I think, that the future decades, the future years can bring. And I was particularly struck, I think, with suggestions that are speaking to the exigencies of our time, the climate agenda, for example, where the ASEAN contributor is my friend and colleague Sharon Sia, where the proposals, I think, that are looking at how to address something that is emerging as a very big concern for, I think, the future survival of our planet, of humanity, I think is a very important type of forward-looking area that we can look at, to forward this people-to-people interactions with that view to helping sustainability. And I think I'll end here with that observation that when I look at all the evaluations, assessments, and discussions that are there, everything that is agreed upon, that's at the regional level. We have the regional commitments, we have the regional agreements and the framework and the institutions and the mechanisms. Prof. Tommy has highlighted there are 30 mechanisms governing all the kinds of intergovernmental, sectoral interactions that we have between ASEAN and India. But ASEAN collectively is also 10 individual member states. And there are differing interests, differing anxieties, differing priorities at the national levels. And I think maybe when we go forward, bearing those differences in mind might help us see where certain initiatives that we push forward actually speaks to and builds on the strengths and the interests of certain countries. And that is also falling under the broader ASEAN framework, where we can also try to see where the broader, larger regional collaborative consultative framework can also help more passive participants or recalcitrant members to get their act together. ESM referred to the trilateral highway. One of the authors in this book, talking about connectivity, has identified Myanmar as a passive participant at best in regional connectivity. And I think these are areas that still present a lot of potential, but we also need to look at situations and conditions and circumstances surrounding the passivity or the recalcitrance, and how we can use regional mechanisms to help certain member states along. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mo. I'll now like to invite my colleague from the Institute of South Asian Studies, Harneek Singh. Please.
Thank you, Iqbal. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Koh just threw a curveball at Mo and me, because we were hoping that with Ambassador Ong and they would have covered most of the ground. And all Mo and I need to do was to say ditto that. Unfortunately, we've been asked to do the honors first, and I'm actually very delighted to be part of the panel. I must also confess that looking at the panel, I'm probably the least qualified to talk about ASEAN. In ISAS, I'm called the jack of all trades, master of some. So ASEAN is not one of them, unfortunately, but I would like to, being part of the project for the last 2 years, I believe I've learned something, and I'm happy to share that with all of you. But first of all, I must thank my guru, Professor Koh, for inviting me to be part of the project. Both Mo and I are actually delighted to be working with him. It is always an honor and a privilege to work with Professor Koh, because when he makes a request, as ESM had alluded to just now, no one says no. So it becomes very easy for the editors to actually follow up on the request made by Professor Koh. So when Professor Koh, Mo and I sat down to do the project, we looked at the India-ASEAN relationship and say, what are the key themes that we want to look at? So we came up with 3. Of course, we looked at the history and the concluding aspect, which encapsulate the relationship. but we look at three broad areas: areas of convergence, areas of differences, divergence, and then potential areas of cooperation moving forward. And what we, and this is where the message that we also want to convey. We also then ask our colleagues and some friends from the research fraternity whether the areas that we are looking at are spot on, and whether these are areas that are very important in the India-ASEAN relationship. We are pleased to announce that we had 7 areas of convergence, 5 areas looking forward as to what we can do together, only 3 areas of differences. So basically that in a way captures the relationship between India and ASEAN. We have a lot in common. We have some areas where we need to work on, but we have a lot of potential to grow together, right? So that's how we arrive at the various topics and themes for the publication. The message that the 3 of us, the co-editors actually want to convey is that ASEAN and India have much to rejoice in their relationship. First of all, there are no disputes between them. After 30 years of dialogue and cooperation, there is a good degree of comfort and trust between the two sides. And the relationship has been generally trouble-free, and there are much potential in advancing it further. So in terms of convergence, as it stands, ASEAN and India have a very close trade and economic partnership, and also share deep cultural and political ties. There is a large Indian diaspora residing in many of the Southeast Asian countries. There are several bilateral economic agreements between the ASEAN member states and India. There is also a strong physical connectivity between the two regions. So in essence, there is so much positivity that's happening between the two, the two regions, ASEAN and India. But being large partners, and as always is the case, there will be definitely some areas of differences. It's quite natural, right? So in the case of ASEAN-India, we identified as 3 which we need to look at. The first, of course, is the China factor, right? While India and China share less than favorable cordial relationship from time to time, particularly in recent years, ASEAN-China relations, in particular trade and investment, have grown strong in the last 3 decades, and that's why India is lagging. Relations between India and ASEAN were also complicated when India withdrew from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in 2019. While we may understand India's rationale and reasons for withdrawing, ASEAN was naturally disappointed by the last-minute withdrawal. So the hope really is for India to reconsider its decision, see the merits of the agreement, and like what Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said at an earlier book launch, the door is always open for India to come on board. So this is an area where we think the divergence can become a convergence if effort is made by both sides. The rise of such concepts and blocs as the Indo-Pacific and the Quad worries ASEAN. ASEAN seems to be given the impression that India does not trust it in being able to manage issues in the region and to be able to stand up to China. So India needs alternatives. So the related concern to all this is the worry that the Quad may become a threat to ASEAN centrality. So that's something that I think Ambassador Ong had also mentioned in his concluding remarks, concluding chapter in the book. So Prof. Tomiko was nice enough to lead both Mo and I in doing an op-ed piece in the Straits Times. And much of what we wanted to say is captured in that piece. What we actually, to summarize what was written there, we actually state that the big picture in ASEAN-India relation is a positive one. We believe that there is tremendous scope for cooperation between the two sides. Many of the areas are highlighted in the book, so I'm making a spill for you to get the book as well. But I will quickly list some of them so that we will have time for discussions afterward. E-commerce and digital connectivity, smart cities development, skills development, food security, energy security, climate change and green technology, environment and sustainability, and pandemic management, among others. Right? So finally, both ASEAN and India, have done much as far as trade and investment is concerned, but we also have much to offer in the social and cultural aspect, which can further bolster our relationship. Some potential areas are religious linkages. I mean, religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism originated from India and have flourished in Southeast Asia. Other areas would include films, drama, cinema, food and cuisine, just to name a few. So there is a lot of potential in terms of the growth between the two regions. But I will stop here, and I'll be happy to participate in the discussion afterwards on issues that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Harnik. Both Mo and Harnik have described how this project is framed, and some of the comprehensive themes that are covered as well. They've also brought to light the multifaceted nature of relations between India and ASEAN, and how we should approach relations between India and ASEAN, but also the interests of India and individual countries in ASEAN as well. Now, to take that further, could I invite Ambassador Ong to share his views on the project?
Thank you, Iqbal. Well, when I was asked to pen something for this particular publication, I wasn't quite sure what I should focus on. Those of you who have known me would probably have read my other essays in other publications, a few other publications, majority of them coming from Tomiko. Someone said just now, when you get a request from Tomiko, you cannot say no. And I think I have written quite a few essays on ASEAN plus something else at the request of Tomiko. So I wasn't sure what else can I add to this particular project on ASEAN-India. So I was really quite reluctant, because although I work in the S. Rajaratnam School of International Study, RSIS, I try to minimize my academic appearances. I am not an academic. My NTU professor told me, to be academic, you must have a PhD. So the other dilemma that I encountered was, I love India's relationship with Singapore, and I participated in nurturing and strengthening the relationship. But as a Singapore diplomat, as someone representing Singapore, and I believe I worked quite strenuously to make sure that our bilateral relationship is on a very good footing. But when I have to write about ASEAN and India, it's a different proposition, As a former Secretary General of ASEAN, I endure 5 years of abuses from my friends in ASEAN, Number one, they think that I am an Indian lover, India lover, and if they know that I used to work for Goh Chok Tong, they will say, you are inflicted with the same kind of fever that he had inflicted on us in Southeast Asia. In other words, whatever India does, it can do no wrong. So that's one angle. The other angle is that many of our ASEAN colleagues, they were not very optimistic about India-Southeast Asia relationship due to one reason or another. Some historical biases, some business rivalry, some just bureaucratic exhaustion for having to deal with Indian counterparts. So to write something about ASEAN-India, it is really quite a challenge. I have to be honest, otherwise going forward, I will have no credibility in working on the ASEAN agenda. And as some of you will know, I am still quite active on some other ASEAN discussions and initiatives. So my first line of defense was to tell Tommy that, I am so busy. Then, whenever you tell Tomiko that you are very busy, he will give you a book about his schedule for the day. Not one sheet of paper, but a book. So he said, if he can manage it, why can't all of us manage our busyness? Okay, so I decided to do one more time for Tomiko. Yeah. Then after I produced my draft, he looked at me, said, this one very critical, eh? Yeah. So I didn't want to argue with him. Yes, I know it's a bit critical, but I'm looking at it from the ASEAN-India perspective. It's not ASEAN-Singapore or Singapore-India. Yeah. Singapore-India, we have a different trajectory, and yeah, we are a small country, so when we write about India and our Singapore relationship, I know my place. Yeah, don't say too much, because we are a small country compared to India. You put Singapore into the Indian territory, you have to really swim a lot to find where it's the little island. Yeah. So it is a big challenge, but I decided that in my role as a unofficial spokesman of some of the ASEAN concern, I have to put across most of the, or as much of the sentiments as I can elicit from my ASEAN experiences. So if you look at my chapter on, my chapter in the book, as Tomiko said, I was critical, yeah, but I trust that many of the points that I put across reflect or originated from my conversation with ASEAN colleagues across the Southeast Asian region. And many of them have been disappointed in their interaction with the ASEAN-India forum. Yeah. And the biggest blow was at the last minute, the Indian decision came not to sign on to the RCEP. Yeah, and you cannot believe the kind of reaction in the room where I was in at that particular moment, talking about ASEAN in general and ASEAN relation with dialogue partner like India and China, Australia, New Zealand, which the other one, Japan. Yeah, and it was so alarming when all of them just kept quiet for a few minutes, and then suddenly some guy from one of our neighboring country, Singapore's neighboring country, said, this is to be expected. And we wasted 2 years of our sweat and time. Anyway, so when I write out the sentences, I actually very selfishly want to assure that I'm no longer declared persona non grata in all the other ASEAN countries. So I try to reflect the mood of the ASEAN colleagues. And to put it in one sentence, most ASEAN colleagues feel that the promise or the potential of ASEAN-India relationship is still unrealized. Yeah, and it boils back to the sense of Indian policymaker. India come first. India consideration or India's concern must always take precedence over anything vis-a-vis India's relation with ASEAN or Southeast Asia. This is to be expected, but there is a romantic thinking in various quarters of ASEAN that after so many decades, perhaps a big country like India can be a bit more indulging and just like the other big dialogue partner countries of ASEAN, give ASEAN a reasonable space or reasonable opportunity to do more together with India. Unfortunately, politics in India and the traditions of the Indian bureaucracy have been such that this did not come about. But I want to stress that regardless of all this, the promise of India is still very substantial. And you have heard the speeches from ESM Goh Chok Tong and Professor Tomiko and others on this panel. You can't run away from India. if you are in Southeast Asia. Yeah. I recall one visit to the Philippines when I was Secretary General of ASEAN, and some Filipino happily declared that they have very minimal links with India, and so if there is one Southeast Asian country not directly connected with India, it's the Philippines. And then another Filipino professor came out with his 3 examples of why such thinking is misplaced. Yeah, India is very much also involved in the Philippines, yeah, and nothing else today. Many of the students in institution in Manila, university like AIM, Asia Institute of Management, and regional body like Asian Development Bank, they are all Indians and good experts on India's role in the regional economy and regional enterprises. And many of the graduates of AIM, they are today CEO and at the minimum some senior executive in regional organization and MNCs operating in ASEAN. So this is something very important. No ASEAN country can say that they are not linked in a substantial way with India. Then the other important prospect going forward is that India's involvement in the digital economy of our contemporary era, you cannot minimize it. And if Southeast Asia, as we always tout the idea that ASEAN has a young population, our 65% majority under 35 citizens of ASEAN are all very IT savvy and they know what they have to do in the digital economy. You can't avoid linking up or doing more with India because India is a huge digital animal. Maybe the full potential has not been realized in some part of this huge digitalized economy, but definitely going forward, Southeast Asian cannot avoid working with India and developing more strongly the infrastructure needed for the digital economy. So there is a lot to grow on. There is a lot that we can work with each other, and we must not go back to too much of history and too much of personal experiences and disappointment to try to put more space between ASEAN and India. So hopefully I contributed to this whole process with my short essay. It's something that all of us can think about, and it's also a message to our Indian colleagues that, yeah, India is a huge continent. Number 2, India is a very vibrant democracy. And number 3, the Indian way has always been quite unique in the history of India-Southeast Asia relation. But definitely 2 of us can do more together, and we look forward to those opportunities that can flourish in the new digitalized world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Ong, for your reflections. Before I pass the mic to Professor Tomiko, I should just add, right, if many of you may have read the op-ed this morning, that's not an excuse not to buy the book, by the way. That's a teaser. Professor Tomiko.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to begin by defending Keng Yong. He's critical, but I will call him a loving critic of India. And all of us need loving critics. So I want to be provocative like him and make 3 points. My first point is that although the ASEAN-India relationship is good and relatively trouble-free, it is suboptimal. Yeah, suboptimal. India is underperforming in ASEAN, and ASEAN is underperforming in India. Take a few parameters. the volume of ASEAN-India trade is less than 10% of the volume of ASEAN-China trade. There's very little investment from India in ASEAN. And on the other side, most of the ASEAN investment in India came from Singapore. So I wonder, why is the Indian private sector not investing in ASEAN when ASEAN is one of the most popular destinations for investors? And I wonder why other ASEAN countries, other than Singapore, are not investing in India. So my conclusion is that the relationship is good, but it's suboptimal. We are not performing to our potential. And I would be provocative and say to my Indian brothers and sisters that your policy of look east, act east are empty words if they are not matched by deeds. So following Keng Yong's style, I want to make this provocative point that look east, act east are just empty words unless you match them with deeds. And we don't see the deeds, you see. My second point is that in late 2019, when India decided not to sign the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, it was greeted with shock and consternation by the ASEAN countries. The ASEAN negotiators felt they had accommodated all of India's concerns and demands, and they didn't understand why at the last minute India decided not to sign. My own assessment is this. I think the world has changed and India has changed. India is now more domestically focused. And India also has very poor relations with China. In fact, as a result of the border clash last year, the relationship between Beijing and New Delhi is very adversarial. Things are so bad that when President Xi and Prime Minister Modi were in Samarkand recently, they didn't meet each other. Yeah? And the Indians also feel that India has opened up its market to Chinese export. But China has not opened up the Chinese market to Indian exports, especially pharmaceutical. So there's a sense in New Delhi that the trade relationship with China is not fair. And India has come to the conclusion that if India were to join RCEP, then the trade deficit with China will grow even bigger. So this is the main factor why India decided not to join RCEP. And there's no point saying to India that the door's open, you're always welcome. I don't think India will come back to RCEP. India will now focus on negotiating bilateral FTAs, which it is negotiating with the UK, EU, and US. It will not, bottom line is, it will not join any multilateral trade agreement of which China is a party. That's my assessment. My third point is one of some concern. I worry that because of this deteriorating relationship with China, India has decided for strategic reason to grow closer to the United States. So India is a strong supporter of the American-inspired concept of Indo-Pacific. The Chinese view Indo-Pacific not as a geographical concept, but as a geostrategic doctrine to contain China's rise. India is also an active member of Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which has been upgraded to summit level. And as you know, the Foreign Minister of China had denounced Quad at the NATO of Indo-Pacific. So this creates a problem, a divergence between ASEAN and India, because ASEAN want to be neutral in the relation between China and India, China and the United States. And China and ASEAN is to take into account China's sensitivity both on Indo-Pacific and on Quad. And although ASEAN has adopted our own position paper, the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, I noticed, Keng Yong, that several ASEAN countries, including Singapore, continue to refrain from using the term Indo-Pacific, and they prefer to use the old term Asia-Pacific. I noticed Singapore leader never used Indo-Pacific, but Asia-Pacific. So I see this another potential area of divergence between ASEAN and India, and it would be a great shame if this were to create a cleavage between us in the future. So those are the 3 points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tomiko. All the panelists have given us much to chew upon and to think about, and we have some time for questions. With a view towards encouraging as much of discussion as we can, I'm going to forego my privilege of asking a question and open the floor immediately. Could I request that you identify yourself, but also in the interest of allowing as many questions as possible, if you keep your question brief, please. So the floor is open, and there's, I believe, a roving mic that would go across. Please, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. I just had a glance through the contents page of the book, and I noticed that nothing much was really mentioned about the defense cooperation between India and ASEAN. May I know why was this so? Why not much of importance was given to defense cooperation? And especially this year, New Delhi and Hanoi, actually they finalized the Comprehensive Defense Cooperation Agreement. Philippines has signed a deal to buy BrahMos cruise missiles from India, and Malaysia is also in the final stages of finalizing a deal to buy India's light combat aircraft. So, I don't know, I just feel that defense is one area where I think there's some good promises. The sector is quite promising between India and ASEAN. Can I have your comments, please? Thank you.
The short answer, sir, is that although there are such recent episodic flourish in our cooperation, ASEAN and India, but actually is very specific, and until recently there really wasn't anything very much. In fact, if you look at the actual activities that take place between India and ASEAN in defense, the most numerous activities, Singapore and India. Yeah, and not only a lot of exchanges and actual training, joint activities, frequency is regular. I remember when I was High Commissioner to India, I had to go down to Kerala because we have an annual anti-submarine training exercise in the Indian Ocean with the Indian Navy. I refused to go onto the submarine as offered because I think I will die of heart attack before the exercise is over. I am claustrophobic, suffering from claustrophobia. But we do it every year, regularly. Yeah. The other defense activities or cooperation, quite episodic, once in a while, or sometimes no continuity. And when I asked my colleague at the ASEAN Secretariat, when I was Secretary General of ASEAN, the response was that, there is always this thinking that not very much can be obtained out of regular training or defense exchanges with India. Yeah, because India was also quite protective of its own information and operational what they call parameters. Yeah, and the most important thing that they are interested in, the ASEAN side, is to have the chance to make friends with the Indian services, the Army, Air Force, Navy. But in many of these areas, there wasn't very much that people could work on. Tabletop exercises, yes, we do some. Sea search and rescue exercises, we also do some. But beyond that, not much. Only in the last, maybe I would say last 3-4 years, things got a bit more worked up and people are seeing such exchanges. Primarily because ASEAN defense cooperation with other partner countries have also been increased or flourishing. So India, in substantiating its role as a major power in the Indian Ocean, they also started to make a few moves to solidify some of these connections with ASEAN countries. So going forward, we can see more happening, yeah, because now that this Indo-Pacific idea is taking more concrete shape, I suppose the other Southeast Asian countries would like to do something more with the Indian defense establishment. For us in Singapore, we are happy because we don't want to be the only guy having so much thing to do with India in terms of the defense side. So we look forward to more activities vis-a-vis ASEAN country cooperating with India in the defense area. So that's my response, my gut instinct. Yeah. Many of these ASEAN defense activities revolve around buying and selling of arms and weapon systems. So if you look at that aspect of it, not much has come from India. And that's why it partly explained why there isn't a lot. Yeah. And then with the Indonesian, with the Myanmar, it's always a question of what's happening in the Andaman Sea, yeah, and there is always the historical concern about too much activity in Myanmar side of the Andaman Sea or Indonesian side of the Andaman Sea, yeah. So those are the historical experiences. Going forward, as I say, I think there will be more coming up, especially now with India in Quad. Yeah, it will be quite interesting next 2-3 years to follow what more can be coming out from the defense sector.
Yes, I've seen 2 hands, so we'll start here first, and then, sorry, Sharon next, sorry. I missed that.
Thank you, and it's very nice to see friends in the panel. My name is Pushpanathan. I was the former Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN, and now a business leader with interest in India and ASEAN. I kind of agree what, as Professor Tomiko you have mentioned. I was in India 2 weeks ago, visiting some of the ministries, and what came out from there is they are very, very interested and focused on the bilateral trade relations, especially with the EU and UK. So that is one important point, I think. Second, I think with the current focus, is India, my question is actually, will India be focused on ASEAN? Because now you have the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework out there. I mean, India's relations with the US, as well as India's role in the Quad. I mean, it's been pressured to do more in the Quad. So in a sense, I would think, as what Ambassador Ong Keng Yong is thinking about, you know, where will India's focus go to? I mean, is it going to be focused on ASEAN? And of course, I agree 100% that when you do business in India, the focus is very much at the national level, right? And they're not looking outwards. I mean, they give you a speech like they're interested in Asia, in ASEAN and all that, but at the end of the day, the focus is very much internal. So in a sense, I see that this book has actually touched one aspect of it in the sense it paints the way forward. But I think what is also needed is the pace of the cooperation, the pace of the development of ASEAN-India relation. That is where I think we need more focus. I've kind of mentioned this in my chapter that I wrote on India Our Minds, I think, that book. And I think that is where I think the focus needs to be. The pace is what is lacking in ASEAN-India relations. Thank you.
May I just add something? Thank you, Mr. Pushpanathan. I think my own feeling is that with the UK now interested in our Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific arena, you know, now UK is a full dialogue partner of ASEAN, and they are seriously moving into formal relationship with the other regional countries through the CPTPP. Yeah. We might get more Indian interest. Yeah. And this is a beef from our ASEAN colleagues. India's role in our region, as far as the ASEAN-India standpoint is concerned, is always not that India feel that individual ASEAN member states or ASEAN as a group is important enough for India. It's always a kind of afterthought or subsequent to some other guys intensifying their relationship with ASEAN. So my suspicion is that going forward, with the increased interest of the UK in ASEAN and ASEAN's trade, multilateral trade arrangement across the region, more Indian businesses and maybe even longer-term policy development will come our way. Because if you look at the role of Indians in the British corporate world and the role of the Indian business and investor in the British activity around different regions of the world, especially in a vibrant area like Southeast Asia or Indo-Pacific area, yeah, there will be interest. Yeah, so now some of our companies in Singapore are reaching out with their friends in the UK to see how they can do a bit more. And the main aim is to try to get India to come out and do a bit more. So that may be one promising prospect going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan, for your comments. I just have two responses. I mean, that's my personal views. I think the first point is the IPEF. You're right. You know, India role in the IPEF and what it wants to contribute. India is caught in a conundrum now. You know, because on the one hand it's part of the IPEF, but it's not sure how much he wants to contribute. But there will be pressure, and actually, naturally, India would have to respond because the other members are expecting a lot more from the relationship.
Opted out of the trade.
Yes. Yeah. So, but the other aspects, you know, that the IPF is looking at, India would have to play a role. I don't see any other option, you know, apart from probably playing a slightly larger role, not remaining on the sidelines. The second one, actually, you know, is a defense of India. I mean, you have to take India as it is. You know, if you start expecting India to be like other countries like China and I mean, of course, the aspirations, the idealism is there that India should be like that. But you cannot give up on India. ASEAN can't give up on India because India is an important partner. And if you look at India's policies, and Prof. Ko is right, the focus now is on bilateral relationship, FTAs and so forth. But it changes. You know, it changes. It's not a permanent fixture of Indian foreign policy making. If you look at the trajectory of how India has fashioned foreign policies, when Modi came in, Prime Minister Modi came to power, ASEAN took center stage. He invited the 10 ASEAN leaders to the Republic Day. He changed the, you know, look East policy to act East policy, albeit, you know, not in terms of substance, you know, more so in terms of words. But so you see the shift in the focus, and like what Ambassador Ong said, eventually India would have to play a role. It cannot just ignore ASEAN and say, you know, because ASEAN cannot serve some of its function, ASEAN becomes irrelevant. Similarly, ASEAN also must realize, you know, when you dance with the elephant, you have to dance to the elephant pace, you see. You can't expect the elephant to dance to your style. So it will take time, but I don't think India is going to forego ASEAN. It may be a temporary phase in India's policy making, but ASEAN will continue to play a role. That's my sense.
Prof. Iqbal caught me in, in the comment I was trying to make to Mr. Ong in responding to Nathan's comment. I think it's, it's not my area, economics, but looking at how the pace, as you talked about it, Nathan, the pace of, interaction, looking at it, is it also a function of, this projection of domestic interest and domestic priorities? After all, foreign policy is part of, national interest. But India itself, we're talking about New Delhi, right? And we talk about intergovernmental cooperation, ASEAN-India. It is intergovernmental, and it is communications and interactions that are largely led by the capitals. But India it has its own state governments. The state governments have their priorities and interests and strengths and so on. So I think this is probably something that we'll also need to factor in going forward when we talk about picking up the pace and actually coordinating what we can do across all these areas of convergence and trying to shore up the areas of divergence by also looking at what can be done when ASEAN member states and ASEAN governments interact with India, the country, and looking at the different strengths and expertise that come in. I think that's important when we talk about the pace, and the pace from India also needs to have that, I think, consideration.
Thank you, Mo. Given the richness of the discussion, we're going to extend the question and answer session by 15 minutes, and so the floor remains open. Sharon, you had a question, yes?
Yes, my name is Sharon, and I'm the coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Center in ISEAS Yusof Ishak. It troubles me every year when the results of the State of Southeast Asia survey comes in. Why does it trouble me? Because we take perceptions of ASEAN respondents towards India, and India is always the lowest. And every year I scratch my head and I'll ask around, why is India so low? It has so much potential. And across all questions, would ASEAN choose India as a strategic third option when it comes to balance of power issues? No. But ASEAN should consider India as a very good choice. Instead, ASEAN chooses Japan, ASEAN chooses EU, and nearly 50% of ASEAN say they distrust India. And when we ask, why do you distrust India? Majority of them say because India lacks political will and capacity to demonstrate leadership. But of the very small minority that say they trust India, they cite the fact that India is a responsible stakeholder for international law. Now this has been consistent results over 4 years. I don't know what the result will be next year because as we see it in the responses towards Ukraine, India has not actually made very strong stand for international law, so that figure may drop. My question to the panelists is how can we reverse that perception of distrust in ASEAN and improve trust for India? Thank you.
I thank Sharon for a very good question. And I would urge all my Indian friends, both here and those listening in online from India, to look seriously at the results of the annual survey. The results are actually very shocking in that when asked which countries are most influential in the region, India is nowhere near the top, Yeah. Why? As I said, India is not performing to its optimum in the region. There's so little trade with India. There are very few Indian companies operating in Southeast Asia. Relatively few Indian tourists come to Southeast Asia compared to tourists from other parts of the world. So in all these important sectors, India is underperforming. That's my basic point today. The relationship is good but suboptimal. And you, India, you're not performing. You should be raising your trade with ASEAN. You should be investing more in ASEAN. You should be sending more tourists to visit ASEAN. You should be having more business links between India and ASEAN, as Karan will tell you in his essay. There's not enough of it. And because India has underperformed, this is reflected in the results of the annual survey.
Anybody else wants to go with that?
My name is Punendra Jain. I'm visiting fellow at ISAS from Australia. I was just curious about the comment which Ambassador Tommy Koh made, that Singapore still uses the term Asia-Pacific, but not Indo-Pacific. As I understand, ASEAN issued ASEAN vision of Indo-Pacific, where it was made clear that ASEAN wants to be, the centrality of ASEAN should be accepted in the Indo-Pacific concept. And most countries around the region, including India and Japan, they have, whenever they have issued any statements, they always make it very clear that ASEAN will remain central to the Indo-Pacific concept. So my question is, why Singapore doesn't use the term Indo-Pacific? What's the hesitation?
It's not just Singapore, and it's ASEAN actually. So let me explain the different worldview, no? Different worldview of India versus the ASEAN country. The ASEAN countries want to be neutral in the relation between and among the great powers. So in the intense rivalry between US and China, ASEAN is neutral. We are not on the American side, we are not on the Chinese side. We are neutral in the rivalry between China and Japan. We are neither pro-China nor pro-Japan, but we are neutral. We want to be neutral in the rivalry between China and India. We are not pro-China or pro-India, but we want to be, this is our role. Our role is that we are neutral, we are acceptable to everybody, we are able to convene meetings in ASEAN and welcome all the major powers to the same table. That's our role, and that's our worldview. India's worldview is very different, you know. Historically, India's foreign policy has always been one of non-alignment, and you treasure your independence. But post-Cold War, you have changed. Post-Cold War, you have changed. You've increasingly drawn closer to the Americans. And I think if our Chinese friend continue to create problems for you on the border, I think you get even closer to the Americans, because you need a countervailing influence to the Chinese. I don't blame you. This is a matter of fact, you know. So your support for Indo-Pacific, your support for Quad reflects your strategic calculations that if China is hostile to India, you need a countervailing influence, and your countervailing influence America. This is your worldview, these are your strategic interests. We understand, and we don't criticize you. But what you're doing is, you're undermining ASEAN centrality. And I suspect over time, not just you, India, but you, India, United States, Japan, and Australia will pay higher priority to the Quad than you do to ASEAN. Of course, you continue to give lip service and say, you continue to say, we love ASEAN, you know. ASEAN is the center of the Indo-Pacific. But this is all empty words, you know. As I say, your deeds must match your words. And the problem with India is you have all kinds of attractive slogans and mantras, look east, you know, act east, but where are the deliverables? You know, you're underperforming in every respect, you know.
Yeah, Masood.
Thank you very much. My name is Masood Rahman. I'm visiting research fellow ISAS. So my question does Tommy, Koh, he mentioned, ASEAN-India trade is 10 times less than ASEAN-India trade, ASEAN-China trade, like $80 billion and $880 billion. difference. So you see China and ASEAN is $880 billion. India, ASEAN is only $80 billion. So if you just give us, what is the most three important reason, like top three reason, why is this, underperforming? Why this less trade between ASEAN and India compared to ASEAN, China? So what are the, there are some kinds of perception is there.
From the private sector or from the government?
I'm from ISIS.
Oh, for ISA. Well, we need somebody from the private sector to answer the question. Your private sector is not proactive enough. Looking for opportunities in ASEAN, increasing your trade with ASEAN. Look at opportunities for Indian investment, investing in ASEAN. The Chinese are very proactive. In fact, too proactive. We need the Chinese to slow down and the India to speed up, because we don't want this unbalanced relationship between China and India. No? Our relationship with China grows by leaps and bounds, and our relationship with India continue to grow, but at the elephant's pace. We want to make it grow faster. It's not good that there's such a huge imbalance. Our bilateral trade with China is about 800 billion. Our bilateral trade with India is about 80 billion, And look at the disparity. Look at the investment numbers, look at tourism, look at business links. The Chinese are outperforming you in every aspect of economic life. And this is a wake-up call for India, because you gradually lose influence in ASEAN if you don't step up and up your game. So my message to you is, to India, is that it's time for you to up your game.
We have time for one last question, and I see a hand at the back.
Yeah, I'm Charles. I'm a management consultant. From a private sector point of view, I think at this moment, China's technological capability and manufacturing capability has already climbed to a point in which it complements ASEAN. Whereas I think for a lot of Indian companies, they look at the companies in ASEAN, they think that they're competitors and they're fighting for maybe the same FDI. I think the Indian companies and the Indian government has to basically counteract China by forming an economic bloc with ASEAN. Because how the Chinese came to be what they are is because they basically told a foreign company, we have the biggest market in the world, transfer some of your know-how and technology.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Your proposition that India and ASEAN should form a bloc.
Yes.
It's totally not acceptable to ASEAN.
Oh, okay.
We don't want to be in a bloc with anybody.
Okay.
We want to be an economic, strategic partner with all the major powers, with the United States, with China, with Japan, with India, with the EU. But we don't want to be exclusively a party to a bloc with any major power, and not even with India.
I'm not thinking about exclusive bloc, but what I'm suggesting is, there's like more towards of a lower trade barrier that, they then can counteract the China position to all the MNC. Oh, we have the biggest market, transfer some of your know-how and technology to us, and that's how they climb up the technological and manufacturing ladder. And this is not happening fast enough, I think, in India. Yeah, thank you.
But if you know India well, India has great companies. It's got global champions. It's got companies that are competing at the global level, So it's not that India doesn't have global champions, it does. But they are not focusing on this region. They are more interested in Europe, in America. So this is a natural hinterland of India for historical, cultural, and other reasons. The two regions have been linked to each other for over 1,000 years. There's so much goodwill here for India. As Chirpong said in his speech, there's so many rich links, not just of the past, but they are alive today. India should take advantage of this reservoir of goodwill in ASEAN for you, and use this opportunity to really up the game. So I mean, that's my bottom line, that we all love India. We are committed to the long-term relationship between ASEAN and India. And And we are even almost sad to say that when I compare the ASEAN-India relationship with the ASEAN-China relationship, the gap is so enormous. I want to close the gap. And if closing the gap is not possible, I want to narrow it. So please help me to succeed in doing that.
On that note, I'm going to have to call a close to the discussion, but I think the conversation may continue beyond this formal setting. So please join me in thanking the esteemed panelists. And the book is available on the counter, so please do purchase the book. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
And thanks to you, Iqbal, for chairing the session too. Thank you.